I always thought home was supposed to feel safe. But looking back, I realized safe was never part of my childhood vocabulary. My name is Eva Monroe, I'm 28, and for most of my life, I was a hostage, just not in chains you could see. My mother, Catherine, had perfected the art of criticism. Every word she said was a test, a trap, a reminder that I would never measure up. My father, Robert, was no savior either. He preferred the role of silent spectator, smiling politely while his family burned around him. I remember the first time I noticed the cracks in our family's perfect facade. I was 22, freshly graduated, ready to bring my ideas to the family business, an old textile company my grandfather had built from nothing. I thought my contributions would be valued. I thought I was trusted. I was wrong. "Eva, darling," my mother said one morning, gliding into the office in her signature beige heels, a glass of sparkling water in hand. "Are you really going to wear that? You're not trying to scare clients, are you?" Her tone was sweet, almost saccharine, but I knew better. Her words were daggers wrapped in velvet. I looked down at my navy blazer and tried not to blush. I thought it was professional," I said cautiously. Catherine tilted her head, pretending to consider it. "Professional? Oh, sweetie, yes, if you want them to think you're timid and unsure of yourself. Very effective strategy." She smiled, as if she had just complimented me. I forced a laugh. She left, and the weight of her judgment settled over me like a fog. My brother, Liam, was the only person who ever saw through her act. He'd give me a subtle wink when she walked by or roll his eyes behind her back. Liam was 2 years younger than me, and somehow, even at 26, he was braver than I was. Brave enough to speak up when the adults around us couldn't be trusted. That day, the first real betrayal came. Not from my family, but from someone I thought I could trust. Derek, my fiancé. He'd been charming, handsome, and convincing. But charm is often a mask, and by the time I realized what he was hiding, I was already in too deep. It started with small lies. "I have a business meeting," he'd say, when really he was at a club. "I'll be late," he'd text, when he was somewhere else entirely. And I, naive and desperate for love, convinced myself I was imagining things. Until the night I came home early from a work event to surprise him. The apartment was dark, the smell of cheap perfume in the air. And there he was, kissing someone who wasn't me. My heart froze. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I simply stood there, watching the illusion of my life crumble in slow motion. "Eva," Derek started, eyes wide, guilty, but the words fell flat. How do you explain betrayal in a language someone refuses to hear? I didn't wait for answers. I left. That night, I packed a single suitcase with what little I truly needed: my laptop, a few clothes, a notebook full of dreams I hadn't dared to write down, and a photograph of Liam and me laughing at some long-forgotten summer camp. I didn't leave a note. I didn't say goodbye. I just vanished. The city I moved to was nothing like my hometown. It was messy, chaotic, full of people who didn't know me and didn't care about my last name. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. Freedom smelled like early morning coffee in a tiny cafe, like late-night walks under neon signs, like the sharp sting of cold air against my face that made me feel alive. But freedom has its price. Every decision I made had consequences, and every night, when the city was quiet, the ghosts of my past crept into my mind. Catherine's sharp words, Derek's betrayal, my father's silent approval, they whispered to me, reminding me that running away didn't mean escaping. It meant learning how to fight. And fight I would. Because I didn't just disappear. I was planning. And one day, the people who thought they had broken me would see just how strong I had become. The first week in the new city felt like stepping onto a different planet. Everything was unfamiliar. The streets, the voices, the smells of food I had never tasted. But there was also a strange kind of thrill in knowing that no one here had expectations of me. I could be anyone, or better yet, no one at all. I found a tiny studio apartment above a bakery on a quiet street. The smell of fresh bread always greeted me in the mornings, and for the first time in my adult life, I didn't wake up to tension or criticism. I was alone, yes, but I was free. Money, of course, was a problem. Running away meant leaving everything behind, including a paycheck. I took the first job I could find, receptionist at a small marketing firm. It was menial, exhausting, and sometimes humiliating, but it was mine. I didn't have a boss watching me like a hawk, and I didn't have a mother rolling her eyes at every email I sent. And then there was Sophie, my first real friend in the city. She was messy, loud, and unapologetically herself, a whirlwind of energy that made me feel alive in ways I hadn't in years. "You can't survive by hiding, Eva," she told me one evening, handing me a cold beer as we sat on the fire escape. "You have to take up space. Own it. Stop letting the world tell you where you belong." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Maybe I had been hiding all along, not just from my mother or Derek, but from myself. Maybe it was time to stop being afraid. Work was slowly becoming more than just survival. I started taking on extra projects, learning the ropes of marketing and business strategy, and realizing that I actually had a talent for it. People noticed. My confidence grew, little by little, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. And then he appeared. Marcus, a kind, quiet man who owned the cafe below my apartment. At first, he was just polite, offering me a free coffee every morning. But his presence was steady, reliable, and somehow comforting. He didn't ask questions. He didn't judge. He just existed in a way that made me feel like I could exist too. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. But life wasn't going to let me forget my past so easily. One evening, while scrolling through social media, I saw a photo that made my stomach drop. There was Derek, smiling at some charity gala, perfectly polished, perfectly unbothered. And beside him, my mother, still controlling, still smug, still thinking they could play their games without consequence. Anger surged through me, a hot, violent current I hadn't felt in months. I had left, yes. I had escaped, but escaping wasn't enough. Not anymore. I wanted more than freedom. I wanted justice. I wanted them to see me as I had become, strong, unstoppable, unafraid. That night, I started planning. Quietly, carefully. I wouldn't rush. I wouldn't make mistakes. I had learned the hard way that patience and strategy mattered more than raw emotion. Every night, I scribbled notes in my journal, building a map of my eventual return, the allies I needed, the information I had to gather, the ways to expose the truth without being exposed myself. And with each passing day, the old Eva, the timid, obedient daughter, the betrayed fiancé, faded a little more. In her place, a version of myself I barely recognized began to emerge, clever, daring, relentless. I didn't know exactly how or when it would happen, but I knew this. One day, I would walk back into that house, into that city, and nothing would ever be the same. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was the author of my own story. And I was ready to write the next chapter in bold, unflinching ink. Months passed, and the city had started to feel like mine. My small apartment, the cafe downstairs, the marketing firm, I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. Every day, I proved to myself that I could be more than the shadows of my past. But thriving also brought clarity. I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. I had learned a hard truth. Running away was only half the battle. The other half, the part one couldn't ignore, was confronting the people who had tried to break me. Derek, my so-called fiancé, who had thought betrayal could be brushed aside. My mother, Catherine, who had shaped my self-doubt into a weapon against me. And even my father, Robert, whose silence had always spoken louder than words. They needed to see the new Eva Monroe, the one who refused to be ignored, underestimated, or humiliated ever again. I started small. I gathered information, quietly, almost invisibly. I scoured social media, company records, mutual acquaintances. I learned who trusted whom, who still believed in my family's perfect image, and where the cracks were. Every tiny detail became a piece of a puzzle I was assembling with meticulous care. At work, I started volunteering for projects that connected me indirectly to people back in my hometown. Small clients, legal documents, supplier contracts, anything that might give me leverage later. Marcus noticed my intensity. "You're planning something," he said one evening as we walked home under the streetlights. His tone wasn't accusatory. It was curious, concerned. I smiled, carefully neutral. Maybe I'm just ambitious. But I wasn't lying entirely. Ambition had become my armor. The girl who once cowered under her mother's gaze was gone. I was learning to wield power quietly, patiently, and with precision. Then, the opportunity came sooner than expected. One of my hometown's business partners, someone who had always been friendly with my family, was in town for a conference. I bumped into him at a networking event, pretending to be a rising marketing consultant representing my firm. He didn't recognize me at first. I had changed. Hair cut sharp, makeup subtle but powerful, wardrobe sophisticated, demeanor confident. The old Eva, timid and obedient, would have trembled in his presence. The new Eva walked in, as if the room belonged to her. "Eva Monroe," he finally said, squinting. Recognition dawned in his eyes. "Yes," I said, extending my hand. "Though you probably knew me as someone else back home." His smile faltered slightly. You look different. Stronger." I let him stew in that moment. Every detail I learned from him would feed my plan. Every slip of the tongue, every memory he unwittingly shared about my family became ammunition. Back in my apartment that night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my desk, notebook open, markers in hand, diagrams sprawling across pages. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming everything I had been denied: respect, power, dignity. Every late night, every whispered secret I recorded, every connection I made, each was a step toward the moment when I would walk back into that city and show them who I had become. Of course, life never makes things simple. Derek, somehow, had caught wind that I was making waves, though not exactly what I was up to. One evening, out of nowhere, I received a text. "Eva, we need to talk. It's time to stop running." I stared at my phone, heart hammering, anger rising hotter than it had in years. Running? I hadn't run. I had escaped, yes. But I hadn't fled from power. I hadn't fled from myself. I typed back one word: watch. It was enough. Over the next weeks, I stepped up my efforts. I reconnected with Liam, who had quietly supported me from afar. He'd always been my anchor, my only true ally in a sea of manipulation. Through him, I learned more about my family's current dynamics. My mother had grown complacent, my father more indifferent than ever, and Derek, predictably arrogant, was still spinning his charm around new victims. And I smiled, quietly, to myself. The plan was simple, in theory, though execution would require every ounce of patience and cunning I had acquired. 1. Expose Derek publicly, in a way that shattered his polished image. 2. Reveal the toxic patterns my mother had perpetuated, without mercy. 3. Show my father that his silence had consequences. 4. Walk into my hometown on my own terms, unstoppable, undeniable. I wasn't thinking about revenge in the petty sense. I was thinking about reclamation, taking back the life that had been stolen from me, asserting my identity, and proving that no one, no manipulative mother, no deceitful fiancé, no absent father, could ever dictate my worth again. By the time I hung up my notebook, the sun was starting to rise. I felt a thrill, a rush of adrenaline I hadn't known in years. This was more than a plan. This was the Eva Monroe Renaissance. And soon, very soon, they would all witness it firsthand. The day I returned to my hometown. The air felt different, thicker, heavier, charged with memories I had tried to bury. Walking down the streets I once knew, I realized how small everything had seemed before, how narrow the corridors of my childhood had felt. And now I was taller, stronger, sharper. I carried myself like someone who had survived a storm and emerged unbroken. I started with Derek, the man who had stolen my trust, laughed at my vulnerability, and thought he could get away with it. I arranged a casual meeting at a charity event, carefully orchestrated so that everyone who mattered would be there. He arrived, confident, in his tailored suit, exuding arrogance. The same arrogance that once made me tremble. I smiled, offering my hand. "Derek," I said, voice calm but carrying the weight of everything he had done to me. "Eva," he said, surprised, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Expectations are dangerous," I replied lightly, letting my gaze drift across the crowd. "Especially when they're based on lies." The whispers began. My carefully planted evidence, emails, photos, witness statements, was circulating among the event's organizers and influential attendees. Derek's charm faltered. His smile slipped, and in that moment, I saw the first cracks in his carefully constructed facade. Next came my mother, Catherine. She was at the same event, surrounded by her usual entourage, her posture rigid, her smile forced. I approached her, calm and deliberate, letting the silence stretch before I spoke. "Mom," I said softly, but every word carried an edge sharp enough to cut. She turned, eyes narrowing, and for a second, I glimpsed the woman who had terrified me as a child, the woman who had tried to shape me into someone small and obedient. "You're back," she said, voice tight. "I never left," I said. "I just grew." Her mouth opened, probably to deliver a cutting remark, but she stopped. Something in my expression, my confidence, made her falter. I wasn't the scared little girl anymore. I was the one who held the power now. Then came the hardest part. My father, Robert. His silence had been the most toxic force of all, a quiet endorsement of everything Catherine had done. I found him in a corner of the event, nursing a glass of scotch, looking every bit the disengaged parent he had always been. "Dad," I said, standing tall. He looked up, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Eva," he murmured. There was no warmth in his voice, just an acknowledgement of reality. "I don't need your approval anymore," I said. "I needed your action, your protection, and I got neither. But I don't need it. I have myself." By the end of the evening, Derek was humiliated, my mother shaken, my father confronted with the consequences of his inaction. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg for recognition. I simply revealed the truth, letting their own reactions speak for them. The crowd whispered. Phones clicked. Social media would explode by morning. Later, alone in the quiet of the empty house that once suffocated me, I reflected on everything I had endured. The anger, the fear, the betrayal, it had all been a teacher. And now, standing in the ruins of my past, I felt an unexpected peace. I hadn't just returned. I hadn't just sought revenge. I had reclaimed my life. The girl who had fled in tears months ago had transformed into a woman who faced the storm with open eyes and a steady heart. And as I looked around the house, the old photographs, the remnants of a childhood full of control and manipulation, I smiled. Not with malice, but with triumph. Because I had learned the most important lesson of all. Freedom isn't about running away. Freedom is about standing up, claiming your voice, and showing the world, especially the people who doubted you, that you are unstoppable. I stepped outside into the cool night air. Somewhere, Derek's phone was buzzing. Somewhere, my mother was grappling with reality. And somewhere, my father would finally understand that silence is not protection, it is complicity. As for me, I walked into the future, unafraid, unbroken, and finally, fully alive.